move forward, right? So the last two questions that we were left with, here's the question which says, use economic theory to explain why New Zealand specializes in dairy products, right? And exports of dairy products and meat, and imports of machinery and consumer goods, right? So the question is a pretty simple and straightforward question. It asks you why this country, New Zealand, is specializing in dairy products and meat and agricultural goods, as we say, and why the country is importing machinery and all that thing, right? So the answer lies in the idea. So you can start off by saying countries, uh, or you can say based on economic theory, right? So what's the idea? Countries specialize on the basis of absolute or uh, comparative advantage, right? Yes or no? Do we know that? Right? Exactly, absolutely. Based on economic theory, countries specialize on the basis of their absolute and comparative advantage, right? Now we can explain both, but I think obviously comparative advantage makes more sense over here, right? But you can only talk about comparative advantage as well. But just for the sake of to be on the safe side, I've written both absolute and comparative advantage. Then you can very quickly define what absolute advantage is. Absolute advantage says that a country should specialize in products which it can produce lower, which it can produce at lower cost, right? Yes or no, right? Or larger quantities. So what is absolute advantage? So absolute advantage is pretty simple and straightforward. It says that countries should specialize in products which they can produce with lower cost or in larger quantities, right? So that's the criteria for absolute advantage. On the other hand, comparative advantage refers to the idea that countries should specialize in products which they can produce with lower opportunity cost. Yes or no? Produce with lower opportunity cost. Okay, now the next thing is really important. As you know, the question is for 4 marks, so you can't just get complete 4 marks just by defining what comparative advantage is. You need to explain why you think New Zealand has comparative advantage in primary products, right? So you can't simply get 4 marks just by mentioning what comparative advantage is, right? And defining this term. You also need to explain why do you think that New Zealand has comparative advantage in primary products, right? Is this correct, right? So for that, what you say is that based on countries' factor endowments, or you can just write the word of the country because we are obviously talking about New Zealand, so we have to be specific. Based on New Zealand factor endowment, it can produce agricultural products, including dairy and meat, with lower opportunity cost, since its factors of production are more suited for production of agricultural rather than manufactured goods, right? So this is what you need to say, right? So the idea is fairly simple, Fizit, as we talked about in a couple of other instances as well, that when do countries have what products countries have comparative advantage in? So that depends on the fact that what type of resources you have, right? So if countries have, simple example would be, perhaps you can relate to Pakistan's example. So Pakistan is a large country with a lot of fertile land with a lot of large supply of labor, unskilled labor, which we normally require in agriculture and all that, right? So we are better suited, our resources are better suited towards production of agricultural goods. We don't have much technology, we don't have much finance to buy machinery, invest in machinery and all those things. Therefore, we can't have a lot of advantage in manufactured goods, which is evident from our exports. We do export some manufactured goods like textiles, football, like sports equipment and some other products, but still the major chunk of our exports is coming from our agricultural products. Why? Because our resources are more suited towards production of agricultural goods. Is this making sense? Right? So that's exactly the same reason with New Zealand, that since it has more, its resources are more suited towards production of agricultural goods, dairy products, and meat. Therefore, those are the products it specializes in, and it exports those products. And the remaining, which it's not very good at producing, those are the products that it will import. Now, we'll quickly move to the towards the marking scheme to see if we have answered it correctly or not, right? For identification of comparative advantage as the relevant theory, 1 mark. For recognition that New Zealand has lower opportunity cost in the production of the dairy products and meat, that's for 2 marks. Like that will get you a total of 2 marks. For recognition that New Zealand has higher opportunity cost in the production of machinery and consumer good, okay, that's just putting it the other way around. For linking the New Zealand's comparative advantage to resource endowment, right? Can you see that, right? So that's what you were supposed to say, right? So that's the idea. And you can also say, excuse me. So for such questions, you can also say that when countries specialize in products which they have comparative advantage, they can produce more output, which allows them to earn higher foreign exchange. Yes or no? Because what's the objective of any country? The objective of any country is to earn as much foreign exchange as much you can. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge is you have limited resources. Okay, fine, got it. Now, with those limited resources, you need to produce products that are best suited for your own factors of production. Yes or no, right? So you should dedicate your resources towards production of those products that you can produce more, and therefore that will help you to earn more foreign exchange, with which you can then buy imported goods which you need, right? Easy, correct? Okay, can we move on? Okay, then the last question here says, discuss whether rising deficit in New Zealand, right? So it says, discuss whether rising deficit in New Zealand's balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in terms of trade after June 2011, right? So for a question like this, we'll need to go back and look at the case study, right? So it says, the question basically, let's read it one more time. The rising deficit, so balance of trade deficit of New Zealand, is what would be expected. Discuss whether rising deficit in New Zealand balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in terms of trade after June 2011. So what has happened after June 2011? Let's talk about that, right? So let's read this. New Zealand's annual trade deficit has increased to $1.4 billion in October 2012, up from a deficit of $875 million in the previous year. The total value of exports in October 2012 was 11% lower than in October the previous year. This can partially be explained by 5.5% rise in exchange rate of the New Zealand dollar over the period, right? Dairy products accounted for nearly half of the decline, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Then what is happening to the country's terms of trade, right? Let's talk about this. Okay. New Zealand terms of trade declined 3.2% from June to September 2012. There was a 13% drop in dairy prices, which contributed to a 32% rise in volumes of the dairy products exported. The net effect on the total value of dairy products was an increase of 16%. Meat prices fell 6%, but the volumes were 11% higher, so that export receipts from the sector were 8.9% higher than June. Okay. Now, what's happening in June 2011? That's what we are that's what we are expected to tell. So have a look at this, right? So terms of trade is declining. Khizr, have a look at this. So this is June 2011. You can see that import prices are relatively stable. In fact, there was also a question that we answered in this regard. right? Describe the change in the New Zealand terms of trade from June 2011 to September 2012, right? And what we saw was that import prices were relatively stable, but there's a sharp decline in export prices. So if export prices are declining and your import prices are kind of steady, right? So what it would do overall to your terms of trade, that your terms of trade will deteriorate or decline, right? Or get worse. Now, with that happening, what effect would that do to your trade deficit? What effect would that do to your trade deficit? That's what you're expected to do. And since the question says discuss, so we do know that we have to talk about both sides of the argument. Do you agree with me? Right? Yes, it would increase, right? So yes, it would increase, like the trade deficit would increase. No, it instead of it, let me write the exact word. Trade deficit is what we're talking about. Trade deficit would increase. No, trade deficit would not increase, right? So these are the two things we are talking about. Okay, now let's get started here. Okay, perfect. Now, what reasons we have to believe that the trade deficit would increase? Now, think about this. When your export prices are less valuable, right, you have to see whether the price elasticity of demand for your goods is more elastic or less elastic. Now, listen to this very carefully. If your export prices are declining and your products have more elastic demand, which means when your products become cheaper, the increase in demand is more than proportionate. The increase in demand is more than proportionate, which is the case with what? Which is the case with dairy products, as clearly mentioned over here, right? It says that there was a 13% drop in dairy prices, which contributed to a 32% rise. So the rise in volume, the rise in quantity is 32%, which is greater than the decrease in price, which is 13%, right? And overall, the net value of dairy products export was increased by, it increased by 16%, right? So the volume is increasing and the export revenue is increasing. So that's a good thing, right? Because it's more elastic demand. Similarly, for the export prices, for the meat exports as well, you can see clearly the prices fell by 6%, but volumes were 15% higher. So the export receipts from the sector were 8.9% higher than June. So these are the two major exports of New Zealand. And when their prices drop, we saw that the quantity demanded increased more than proportionately, and therefore the total export revenue that you earned was higher. Is that correct? Right? So the first thing that you'll write is that the two major export items of New Zealand, dairy products, meat, have more elastic demand, right? Which then you will go on to explaining that, you know, when the demand is more elastic, any decrease in price results in more than proportionate increase in quantity demanded, therefore leading to higher revenue, correct? Okay, now we'll move forward, Khizr, and you know, we'll talk about if there is any other evidence that makes us believe that it will improve the trade deficit. Sorry. Sorry. I wrote it over here. It should not have been over here. It should have been over here, right? So the two major export items in New Zealand, namely dairy products and meat, have more elastic demand, which then you'll explain that it would overall result in higher export revenue, right? Okay, now moving on, let's see if there is some more evidence. Exports of transport equipment fell by 7.2% volume terms, which was likely to reflect reduced economic activity. The key markets for New Zealand manufactured exports, right? Demand in Australia is expected to recover. Interest rates, custom, you know, right, are showing signs of improvement, right? Okay. Then we have, right, New Zealand annual trade balance deficit increased from this to this. The value of exports was this. This can partially explained by the rise in the exchange rate, right? Okay, nearly half of the decline in exports, right. Okay, now what about Walaikum Assalam, Suhan, how are you? Okay, so Suhan, we are doing the last question of this previous case study that we started off, but we could not complete. That was May, June 2014, and that was about New Zealand, if you remember, right? So New Zealand trade performance and all that, right? So the question here says, have a look at this. The question says, discuss whether a rising deficit in New Zealand balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in the terms of trade after June 2011. So whether you would expect the New Zealand trade deficit to increase due to its deteriorating terms of trade, as we can clearly see that in June 2011, right? This is June, your index of export prices is significantly, this is export prices, you can see, right? So these are export prices, and you can see clearly export prices are declining significantly. Your import prices are kind of readily considerably stable, right? And that's why your overall terms of trade has deteriorated. Now, with a deterioration in your terms of trade, would your trade deficit increase, decrease? That's what you're expected to answer, right? Right, very good. Okay, so Zuhan, so first of all, what we said, and this is what we got from the case study said that when your export prices fell, have a look at this. So there was a 13% drop in export prices, which contributed to a 32% rise in the volumes of dairy products, right? The net effect on the total value of dairy exports was an increase of 16%, right? So since these products are more elastic, so dairy products, and same goes for the meat, right? So meat and dairy products are two major exports of New Zealand, and when prices drop, in the past, right, we do know that they have resulted in more than significant increase, more than proportionate increase in their quantity demanded, and therefore resulting in overall increase in revenue, right? So this argument goes in the no part. Why? Because no, the trade deficit will not increase. Why? Because you will get to export more quantity, and therefore you will get more export revenue, right? But then what about the products that you're importing? If you're importing, right? Sorry, if you're importing more inelastic goods, right? Trade deficit decrease, it would depend on the PED of exports. Absolutely correct. Right? Now, what about the goods that you're importing? So you can see clearly that your import prices didn't change much, didn't change, a slight decrease and so on, right? So if your import prices are relatively stable and the demand for your imports is inelastic, let's see if we have some evidence of that. Exports of transport equipment fell 7.2% volume terms, which was likely to reflect reduced economic activity in Australia and United States, the key market for New Zealand manufactured goods. Demand in Australia is expected to recover in 2013, aided by interest rate cuts and renewed economic activity in China. Furthermore, prices for many New Zealand key exports commodity, blah, blah, blah. Right? Okay. What else? Students, so if your import prices are kind of steady, right, and you are importing goods that have, inelastic demand, right? So prices for imports haven't changed a lot. And let's say if you are importing inelastic goods, right? So then your import expenditure would not increase significantly. I repeat myself, think about this, right? So in case import prices would have been rising, what would you expect, right? You would expect that, and given there is inelastic demand, import prices are rising. If let's say, and for imports, if a country has inelastic demand, then you have to import those products no matter what. Like think about Pakistan, what's happening with Pakistan right now. Oil prices are skyrocketing and we can't afford to not import oil. I mean, it's a very basic thing used in industries and transportation and all that, and we have to import oil. So we are spending more money to import that, right? But that is the case where import prices are on the rise. Here, import prices are kind of steady. Yes or no? In fact, a slight decrease as well. So if you look at June, this is exactly June. So here somewhere was your import prices initially, and by the end of September 2012, your import prices slightly declined, right? And if you're importing inelastic goods, then is that a good thing for you or a bad thing for you? Is that a good thing for you? What do you think? Depends export prices of competitive countries. If they're less than New Zealand, then even if the terms of trade